Hey guys, I'm Ben, and Noah's here with me.
Hello.
It's actually Noah's channel, so I
Yeah.
don't know why I'm starting.
I don't know. I'm new to this.
Okay, so what was the goal of this?
So I started off. I built the first lightsaber.
I'll have images of that.
Yeah, I'll have a link to that.
Okay.
I started off with the first lightsaber. I was going to make it for Ben, and it was going to be Luke Skywalker's lightsaber, but really beaten up, and so it's supposed to look like it was from Star Wars Episode 8, I guess. Really beat up and worn, and over the ages
And
of,
this is
of Luke owning it.
This is pre Episode 8 when we're recording.
Right. This was.
So we're aware.
Yeah. Yeah, and at the time that I had started it, it was actually, it was slightly before Episode 7 came out. Even
Yeah.
the time that I had started building the first lightsaber. But anyways, so I was gonna build that one for him, and I started getting really attached to the thing and trying to decide which design he would want in the first place. I couldn't decide between Luke's second lightsaber and Luke's first lightsaber, which is previously Anakin Skywalker. Anakin Skywalker's lightsaber.
Yeah, it's Anakin's second lightsaber.
Yeah. So I was trying to decide between those two because I thought that he liked Anakin's, but I wasn't sure because he's mentioned stuff about Luke's as well. Finally, I decided after I had finished it, I was going to just tell him that I would build him one and let him pick the design that he wanted. And so he came up. He went and did some Google searches and tried to find a design of a lightsaber that he liked, and this is the one that he found.
And it was eventually edited down. I took it into Photoshop and edited it the way I wanted the final product to look. The final paint job, at least. The overall dimension of the lightsaber is pretty much the same overall, with just slight variations probably here and there. The biggest differences are the paint job, which is the just a silver or black gunmetal finish, with a red button still. Here's the measurements that you did for it.
And I printed out the picture before we had decided on the paint job at all. I originally thought that it was going to just be the brass color. That was the original plan, and then we went through a bunch of different ideas later on when it got really close to being ready to paint. But here I just printed out, I crappily masked out the picture and printed it on just a sheet of paper, and then I took all the measurements from the piece of paper with calipers, just with a pair of digital calipers, and scaled them up. I just multiplied every dimension that I took off of that by 1.356, I think, and then that was the size that I wanted to go with. And then I cut a chunk of 4x4 that we just picked up at Lowe's. I cut a chunk off that was about double the size that I need, length that I needed it to be, so that I'd have plenty to clamp onto with the vise without worry of clamping too hard and sending a crack into the part that I want to keep and to be good and used for the final thing. So I just cut it down to a 2x2 first from a 4x4, which is the 2x2 is what you see there. Next, I cut it into a cylinder, and by doing that, I just cut off the corners of the 2x2. I made it an octagon, and then I cut the corners off the octagon, and then I rounded those over with a file and kind of a sand belt, I guess, from a belt sander. I just did that by hand, sanded it to kind of smooth it out a little bit more, and then it became a cylinder, more or less.
Okay.
I also checked it with calipers several times to make sure either side was more or less parallel to the opposite side.
And here you're
I'm bringing it down to the lower. Basically, I'm separating the knurling, or what will become the knurling, from the rest, the main diameter of the whole lightsaber. I took it down first to the diameter that I needed with a variety of files, mostly the narrow one that you see me using there. In that one, I scored where I needed to go to, where the knurling would start and stop, and I just carved it down from there with the needle file. And in the next video, you see there's a step down from the knurling that's just before what would be considered the pommel of the hilt, and that's what I'm carving there. So the high spot in the middle is what will be the knurling down the road, and I just use the same technique as for early on, and that's
the finished product.
And the picture is, that's the finished product.
Yeah, so that's just where
right,
to the right of that last lip is where...
Right, so where you see that it steps down for about a quarter of an inch in length along the long side of it. Where it goes back up, that's the excess that will be completely cut off. So this next video, I'm scoring the lines for the knurling. I started with a chisel, and then I decided that an X-Acto knife would be much quicker, so I just used my X-Acto knife to score all of those. And then I took the X-Acto knife at kind of an angle and scored them out a little bit better, so that the chisel would have a better time of getting through there without tearing out what I don't want it to tear out. And so that's a 1/8 inch chisel, which I got for a different project, which came in quite handy for this. Yeah,
and was that the exact size needed for?
Yeah, it happened to be that the wide gaps in the knurling were exactly an 1/8 inch.
Yeah, and this is just...
yeah, I tried for the narrower gaps in the knurling. I started with a coping saw, and I noticed that it was tearing out a lot more than I wanted it to, so I started with a needle file, and I was also scoring them at the time, but I later decided that was pointless. I didn't need to do that, really, because it wasn't benefiting anything, it was just taking more time. And yeah, that's just a V-shaped needle file, probably a 1/16 inch wide at the top, at the wide part.
You said the X-Acto blade was number 10.
The X-Acto blade is number 10.
It's a number 10 general purpose X-Acto blade.
Right. Yeah. As far as the needle files go, my dad just had those, so I just used them. Where he got them or what brand they are, I don't know, and I don't think that's probably necessary either.
Yeah.
You can probably just get any needle files. These were pretty small needle files, and they didn't have much of a handle. It was just the kind of the tang of it. All right, and so next is the finished knurling, and you can see on the front end of the top of this picture, you can see where I added a few little details. I didn't take any close-up pictures of that or videos or anything, but there's just a little kind of a bead. Well, not a bead. It's there's a groove cut in the front end, and then it steps down just before that to about a 32nd of an inch down in diameter. All of the finished photos I took, and these I took with a telephoto lens. Okay. So it should be pretty flat. It was only at about 140 millimeters, but that's still pretty good, I think. This is a part of the emitter shroud. I cut around. I have a miter saw with a back on it, or I cut a piece of 1/4 inch birch ply and clamped that on with parallel clamps, and that was my depth stop, so that I could saw around that whole piece, rotating it in the vise every 45 degrees or so around it, to get those grooves that you see, and then I just went in and, as the video shows, cleared it out the rest with a chisel, which made it much easier to cut away what I wanted to cut away and not what I don't want to cut away. So,
and afterward you beveled.
Right, I beveled the edge. Right, I added a little groove that was as well with the same V-shaped needle file that I used for the knurling. And I should note, actually, that the knurling I also went in later with a rectangular needle file. It had straight sides to widen the gaps in the small gaps in the knurling, because they seemed too narrow to me, so I made them a little bit wider with a different needle file.
And here
I'm roughing out the button. I don't have any more footage or or photos even of the process of that. But this is how I do most of the cylinder pieces that are small enough that I would make them out of a block of wood. I just cut it roughly with a coping saw, and then I round it around with a file, make sure that's square to the sides are square to the face.
And then eventually.
I got to the button, yeah, and it was done. Eventually, it looked good, ish.
I sanded it down.
I genuinely don't even remember how I got to that point. I don't remember any of that process, so I can't really explain it.
And next is the.
Next is probably the biggest part of the emitter shroud.
Yeah.
So I just drew the diameter.
Started with this.
Right. I drew the. I needed
Second
two different
smallest,
diameters.
Yeah, the smallest.
So I drew a circle on the top of the diameter that I needed to end up with there, and you can see that between those two lines is where I need to cut away to get my two separate diameters. And I started with cutting in on the line that is on the side, and I also used a depth stop for that so that it would stop at the diameter that I needed to end up with. So I just did that as well with the miter saw with a back on it. And then I cut down, I then took a coping saw and cut down, straight down from there, on about every 90 degrees on the top of it,
exactly
the
every
face
90
of it.
degrees.
Yeah. Not exactly, I just eyeballed it, but I cut down to that, and then I cut off the corners, more of the excess of that, the same way, cutting down,
Yeah. Is this,
which is what you see in the video,
yeah, you're just watching.
in the first video, yeah.
Constant reshaping of it.
Yeah, and putting a block on top just to make sure I don't mark up the piece too much, and my OCD cleaning of the sawdust around it, cleaning it even when it's not necessary. So then I ended up with an octagon, more or less, and then the next, I sanded a little bit. Then in the next video, I'm rounding those corners off so that it becomes the cylinder that I need to end up with. Now for the end result of this,
It's gonna be a jump.
yeah, it's
So
going to
it's
be a
beveled.
jump because it's beveled and rounded and everything. So that for the top of this smaller diameter, I just rounded that over with a file and sandpaper. For the lower bevel, the larger diameter, I did the same thing, but I did that with I got it down to about that size with an X-Acto knife, and then I got it down the rest of the way with safe edge file, needle files. The smaller groove was a little tricky. I kind of where it kind of
Oh, that at the base.
yeah, the groove at the base there, I guess. I cut straight down. Well, I scored it first with a X-Acto knife in the hopes that that would work, but it didn't really. And then I cut in with the same V-shaped needle file. Just kind of cut a bit of a groove there, and then I brought that lower half, where it kind of steps in almost,
Yeah.
I guess. I brought that down with needle files as well, and then there's a groove between the two different diameters that I also just cut with needle files and safe edge file.
And then here's
So,
the
then-
bottom piece.
Right,
One of the bottom
the
pieces.
finial. So I cut this is one of the only pieces that I cut a piece of dowel rod off. I don't remember what size dowel rod that is.
It's the same
It
piece,
started
right?
as a dowel rod, and I cut. Yeah, it started as a dowel rod, and I cut with a depth stop on the saw again to the depth that the narrowest point on the finial with the saw, and then I rounded it roughly with an X-Acto knife to get the most of it cut away, and then I rounded the rest of it over with a needle file an assortment of needle files.
So that line through these
Right,
represents where you're beveling from.
Those two lines
That's
are
the
centers. Yeah, those are the equator. And then it ended up as
that.
a nice rounded finial, which looks very slightly different from the original picture, but it's close enough. Well, no, it's just the original picture of the lightsaber that we based it off of.
Oh.
That one looks slightly different.
Yeah,
it's just kind of more pointed. The equators of the along the equator.
Here you're working.
This is the frontmost piece of the lightsaber. This is where.
Okay, so this is the.
Yeah, this is like the very front of it.
Cap.
The cap, I guess you could say, yeah, of the emitter shroud. And then I just cut a cylinder, and then I used a protractor for that to check the angle to make sure it's more or less correct. That's basically that for that piece. There wasn't much to that one. That didn't take very long. The next piece is a
reject.
Kind of yeah, it is a reject. It's the little silver piece right next to the piece on the top of the lightsaber, of the whole lightsaber.
It's the piece next silver. To the nut.
Right. Yeah, it's the piece with the hex on it.
It's the piece next to that.
Right. Yeah. Yes, it's the piece next to the piece with the hex. So,
above it.
This one was rejected because I forgot to leave extra length to drill a hole to put that one in. So basically, that I also cut a piece of dowel rod off with and rounded it over just with sandpaper. And I did the same thing for the one that's actually on the lightsaber. So the next piece is the piece with the hex. The piece with the hex.
The nut.
So that center diameter, I genuinely have no clue what that is. The circle, yeah, that is drawn on there. I don't know why that's necessary, but it was probably, I'm guessing it was for laying out something, whether it was the sides of the hex or the dome or something. I'm not really sure. So the edges of the hex are the edges of the diameter of the dome on the top of the piece are tangent to those faces of the hex. Why that small circle is on there, again, I have no idea, but I drew a bigger circle that was the size that I needed, and I took the corners off first. I marked it along the sides of the piece, and then I cut in just with a file to round it around so it would be a cylinder on top of the hex. And then I just took a rod or a pipe that was about the diameter of the lightsaber, the part of the lightsaber that it would be attached to, and I just held a piece of sandpaper on top of that, wrapped it around it, and then I just took the piece and I sanded it. And the next is the picture of
or a bunch of the pieces.
Basically all of the pieces.
The end.
All of the.
Some of the end, some of the siding and stuff.
Almost all of the small pieces,
Yeah.
Except the lever, the pin for the lever, and the piece that the O-ring, the belt hook ring attaches to, because
that's metal.
That was made out of metal. Yeah, that my dad machined.
And you put together a lot of these pieces into this.
Right. For this picture, I just stacked them on top. I didn't actually assemble them yet because we needed to drill holes through them separately.
Yeah.
Not while they're all attached together, because it's a lot easier to clamp onto each one individually than all of them at the same time.
You need to drill into it because you were going to have
for the dowel rods that hold them together, the framework, and I also needed to drill into the front for the blade. The hole that the blade goes into.
The blade can fit into it, kind of.
Right, it's just a 1/4-inch dowel rod is
Just
what the blade is.
And then here.
And the next picture is partially assembled, so I've put the emitter shroud and all of that on the front. But you can see that I still have the excess, which is what I'm holding on to there.
Yeah.
And I haven't attached any of the pieces that go on the main body of the hilt itself yet. So,
or the base.
Right, and I don't really have any pictures or videos of that process because it was all very fast and involved glue, so you don't have time to worry about the camera really, or I didn't, because I'm bad at multitasking.
And eventually, once he put it all together, it looked like that.
Right, we have no picture of the lever,
Pretty big
the
jump.
pin, or
The lever was...
I just realized that I also don't have a picture of the lever box, the box that the lever is inside of.
Oh, yeah.
The triangular, I guess, with the triangular top.
Mm-hmm.
That, I just made a rectangle. I drew the lines that I needed for the triangular side. And I just cut most of it away with a coping saw, and then I filed the rest down to the proper dimension. And Dad drilled out the hole.
Mm-hmm.
He drilled three or four holes along the line, and then I just carved out the rest with a chisel and files, almost the same way that you would a mortise.
Mm-hmm.
The pin is just a dowel rod, probably, I guess it would be 1/8 inch, if I had to guess. I don't know exactly, and the lever is, that and the dowel rods are the only pieces that aren't pine. The rest is pine.
Mm-hmm.
The lever, I think, is maple, but it could be something else entirely, because it was just in a stack of lumber that we had lying around.
It's just a stronger wood, basically.
It's just a more dense, it has a tighter grain, so that it's less likely to break, which was necessary because it's a lever, you know.
Yeah, it moves.
It's literally
A bunch
something
of
that
torque.
it's something that is often very able to break.
Yeah.
So
You use it a lot.
yeah, and so that I just roughed out the shape. I measured the rough length of it, overall from the front end to the tail of it, I guess, and I just eyeballed the rest. I kind of, because it's a more tricky thing to measure, with all of the curves and stuff. It's not something I'm very good at measuring.
And here we also have the
Yeah, you
end
can see
piece,
the machined piece, which is metal there.
and that's
clearly.
where the circle goes through.
Right, that's where the
Scientific term.
circle goes through. Yes, that's where
The ring.
the O-ring that we just picked up. I think that was at Ace Hardware. I don't even know what it was supposed to be used as, but we just cut it open. It was originally closed. We cut it open so that we can bend it and fit it around and through that hole. And you can see some nice detailed shots up ahead,
Yeah.
and we'll let you enjoy those.
Okay, here's one where it shows the actual ring on the end, and that's just
Right, it's
before
not
you hammer it
attached.
together.
Right, it's not attached yet. I didn't really hammer it
Did you
together.
hammer it?
No, I did not hammer
The
it together.
blacksmith.
Like a blacksmith, yes. I heated it up until it was molten red hot and almost bendy, and then I slap that sucker on there.
Play-Doh.
It was easy.
Okay, and now we have paint tests coming up, which
A
is just
bunch of paint tests.
like almost too many.
Yeah.
I remember this.
Well, you were a real stickler about it though, so I had to do a bunch.
I don't think I was
You
that
didn't.
big of a
You didn't
stickler.
let me not do a bunch.
I was kind of like, do your thing.
Yeah.
It's silver.
No, you gave me no direction as to what you wanted, even.
So to compensate, you made 50.
Right. Just to be sure, I got something along the lines of what you wanted. So this was when he decided. This is when you decided that you wanted not brass, but something that was silver and maybe even gunmetal or black with paint scraped off.
We did a
I guess.
lot of tests with texture paint and those can be seen in a few images away, but this was just testing like corrosion, I think, maybe.
No, this was the this was actually the silver, the aluminum tape.
Oh.
So it's just a
So that's
roll of
tape.
aluminum tape. Yeah, that's tape. So it's usually used for heating and ducts. I learned that from Adam Savage from MythBusters as well. So.
Because duct tape is actually really bad at.
Oh yeah,
Normal
it's
kind
really
is
bad.
really
at,
bad at
it's
doing
actually
one
really
job.
bad at insulating ducts. Apparently.
It's pretty pathetic.
Yeah.
I
it
guess they
is.
just named it after the one thing it couldn't do. Which
Yeah,
makes
well,
sense
originally it
in
was named
hindsight.
duct tape, but we're going off topic a bit here.
Yeah.
So it's it's 3M brand aluminum tape for insulating ducts, and make
you
sure
didn't use it.
right. I didn't use it, but
If you want to do
if
paint
you
tests,
want to use it, if you like the way this looks, then you can get it. It's 3M brand.
And you did that twice, once with like a browner.
Right, you mentioned something about maybe having brass and bronze colors down in the nooks and crannies, so that's what I tried to do in the second picture. And that didn't really look that great, I didn't think.
It looks very woodish.
It looks weird.
It's like
well,
wood.
well, I mean, I didn't really fill the wood grain for this
Yeah.
as much, and that's also just the texture that the tape kind of has. It has a brushed steel kind of, especially since I made it have a brushed steel. I went over it with steel wool. You can do that to get it a little bit less shiny and a little bit more of a brushed steel look.
And is this still?
I basically just, to get the black down in there, I spray painted.
Is this still metal?
Right.
Tape?
This is still the metal tape. For quite a few of the pictures. For about 9 or 10 of the pictures, it is
Are complete failures.
our complete failures. Yes, we didn't remotely use those.
And here you have a.
This one had
texture
some texture paint. It didn't have a very heavy coat on it compared to the final picture that you'll see of the paint test. That one had a much heavier coat. I held the texture paint much closer to the piece to give it more of a cast metal look. This just kind of added freckles for no apparent reason, but that was also some weathering tests of what the gunmetal would look like, what the silver spots would look like, and what the dings and dents and scratches would look like.
And is this the same piece right here?
Right, it's all the same piece.
So
I have two different I did 2 different sides of it. So where you see my crappy imitation of the knurling there,
Yeah.
where it doesn't look anything like the knurling, but I didn't need it to really. I just needed to have
Simulate it.
a vaguely similar texture to the knurling.
But
So,
we didn't really use these either.
right, we didn't
the,
use these.
We didn't use this
We
one.
used the overall color
we
palette and weathering for
Yeah,
some of it. We went with in
We did make a gradient
this
here.
picture where you can see somewhat of a gradient. Yeah, the middle color is the one that we kind of went with for the gunmetal, or it's the one that we were going to go with. And then I think I ended up getting carried away with the dark gray and got it a little bit more like the one on the far right. So
It works though.
yeah, I like it better.
And then
anyways.
this last piece is
The last piece, that's just a piece of PVC piping that we had laying around.
Just
and I
texture test or test the texture paint.
right, and the paint job overall. I was pretty happy with this paint test. I liked it a lot.
It's like really corroded.
But I was still very concerned about the texture paint, filling in details that would have looked better if they didn't have the texture paint in them. And also, mainly because if you decided that you didn't like the way it looked once it was done with the texture paint, that would have been a pain to sand off.
Yeah.
That's an understatement as well. Yeah. Yeah.
So we didn't go with this, but like the
Right, but the overall, it has the gunmetal, it has the lighter silver, and it has, I don't think it has much dirt actually, it just has rust. Because there aren't any dings and dents, because that just scraped the paint off.
You can see it in the threading.
Right, yeah, in the threads you can see mostly the rust.
And then here's the lightsaber.
This was
once you started.
This was with the blade in and the I had already put, huh?
Yeah, what's on it?
That's a coat of primer there. That's just a scratch filling, like for automotives.
Is there anything underneath that?
There is. There are, I believe I did 5, or was it 6? I did 5 or 6 coats of a sealing epoxy. So I went over it with primer to see if it looked good enough, and it wasn't. So I sanded off the coat of primer, put a few coats of black spray paint on, I believe 1 or 2, I think maybe just the one.
You probably have putty inside of the
Oh yeah, I also have clay inside of the lever box. You'll notice that I don't have the lever in. I filled that with clay so that I wouldn't get paint down in there, because I want it to
move.
I don't want to fill it with paint. I want it to stay the size that it already is, because it's the size that it needs to be. And you'll see in the painting time lapses how it's partially, you can see some of the wood grain through the paint. You can see some wood grain and wood color. I could see some telltale signs of wood grain. So I did sanding, and then I put more on with the airbrush after waiting an hour, because it still wasn't good enough, and I put more on with the airbrush, and eventually I don't remember how many times I did that, but I eventually got to the point where I was like, yeah, I can barely see the wood grain, so, and once I'm done with it, I probably won't be able to. And sure enough, once I was done with it, you can't really tell. So, and that's the blade painted the color that it is. That's the finished color, yeah.
And here, you're airbrushing.
Here's the airbrushing, and
it's already time-lapsed.
It's already time-lapsed, yeah. It's very hard to see, because in order to get a good coat down into the knurling and in all the nooks and crannies of everything, I needed to be able to move it around a lot and kind of hold it in my hand, so that's what I did. And you'll notice that the front end of that, the very front, where the blade comes out, I forgot to mention this earlier, it's brown, but I just now painted over it. That was, I had a bunch of brown paint that I probably wasn't going to use for anything. So I took that and I put that on the end to add some texture, because I was out of texture paint, of course. And I just took a toothpick, I took globs of the brown paint, and I just kind of splattered it on. Most of it is in the center where the blade comes out, is toward the center where the blade comes out, and it fades out from there to give an impression that the front end is melted from the extreme heat of the plasma blade.
And you masked it off with painter's tape.
Right.
Paint the tip now.
Right. The first time I used masking tape, I mean, it didn't really matter though, because it wasn't painted to begin with, so it didn't matter if it pulled the paint off, because there was no paint there to pull off.
Currently you're weathering.
Right. I'm weathering now, and you can see I'm just using a...
So it's a putty knife?
So, yeah, it's a putty knife, more or less. I don't think that's actually what it's called, but more or less it's a putty knife.
Brutally hammering.
Right. I used just a brass, I guess it's a brass rivet that hasn't been riveted on, obviously, to add some dents, because it has a nice rounded top to it. I also used a ball peen hammer. You can see me smacking the thing with the handle of the spatula, more or less. And I also kind of cut some grooves into it with that, because I felt that added some really nice, just basic nicks and scratches and stuff like that. And I also have a long bolt there that I used for some of the larger stuff. And I don't know what that thing is. The almost triangular shaped thing is.
Looks like
it's a pin or a miniature railroad spike. I don't know what it is.
That's what I was gonna say.
But regardless, it adds some nice some nice basic dings and dents here and there. And I kind of just smacked it everywhere with nails and bolts and stuff like that.
And now you're going over it with a wash.
Now I'm washing it, yeah, and I'm just using acrylic paints. There will be links to those in the description. The specific ones that I used, if I can find them. And I'm just going over it with washes, kind of haphazard. I'm not really an expert at this, so I kind of just put it everywhere, because I didn't know where it would be. You'll notice maybe that I tried to put it, and you'll notice me holding my hand on the lightsaber. I was trying to determine where my hand would be, usually, when I hold the lightsaber. And that would be where most of the dirt would go, I would think, because the dirt would come off of your hands.
Most of the wearing, too.
I probably shouldn't have gone with such a dark dirt for that, because I guess the guy was, fixing rusty, greasy machines before he picked up his lightsaber and used it, which I suppose makes sense. Maybe he's a tinker like Anakin, something like that, maybe. Before this, I had actually unfortunately forgotten to film the first pass of weathering. So before I went over it so I did the base coats of silver, and then I did gunmetal on top of that, and then I masked it off and did the silver parts. And it looked really cartoonish, and it really bothered me. I did not like it at all, any of it at that time. I decided I was going to go over it with a rough weathering pass, so I went over it with a wire brush and some steel wool, and kind of scratched away the gunmetal to reveal the shiny silver beneath, to make it look like it had been scratched. I did that, and I went over it just with a gray paint, a dark gray paint, to give it some variation in the metal, and then I was finally at least somewhat happy with it. So I don't have any footage of me doing that, which is a bummer, but live and learn, I guess. So this is the more in-depth. I had done two coats of clear coat, and then I began the second pass of weathering, which is what you see in these videos. And that's the more down into the nooks and crannies, involves a lot of rubbing the paint off, which is why you do the clear coat first. One thing that I wish I had done was gone over it with clear coat, because there was some stuff that I did with this where it was still kind of general and big surface areas, where I kind of left it on, and I wish I had done something that allowed the paint, the dirt to be, because when I put clear coat over the entire thing once I was done, and that made everything the same reflectivity. So the dirt was just as reflective as the metal, which kind of bothers me. That is pretty much it.
And the whole thing was made by hand, like all hand tools.
It was all using hand tools. Everything except drilling the holes was done by hand.
Okay. How long would it take, though? Like, how long did it take?
How long in hours? Or in...
In hours, probably.
In hours, it took the average, I guess, or the rounded number would be 150 hours. So, yeah, a lot more than it would take you if you just used a lathe like most people would. But I wanted to do it completely by hand with hand-powered tools, because that's the way that I like to do woodworking. So yeah, I believe that's pretty much it. And the lever moves.
The lever moves here.
We shot a crappy video of it because I forgot to shoot a good one of it. I didn't really forget, I just thought it was unnecessary, but you convinced me otherwise. So yeah.
That's about it.
That's about it.